Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about third-party risk, something that we dabbled in on the technology side, but there's a much broader world out there. And with me to discuss it is Luke Nordlie, the Head of Business Development for third-party risk in our outfit. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Eric. Very excited to talk to you and your audience.
Well, you and I have talked about this. We've been in some customer events around this. It's an area where there's not only a lot of change, a lot of impact on the regulatory side, certainly a lot of history on this. There are so many different pieces to it. Before we get too far down the road, I wanted to, for our listeners, to dig into a little bit of background about third-party risk concerns and what are the key elements around third-party risk and how it really plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when you kind of think back pre-technology days, the theory of supply chain risk has always been around. The risk of having products, services, goods moved around from place to place as a part of a supply chain had always been in the forethought of manufacturing companies, oil and gas companies, et cetera, et cetera. However, when we really started seeing the advent of the technology world, the theory of outsourcing at the technology space became much more important. And of course, when anything becomes much more important or quote unquote creates risk in the industry, regulators generally really like to become involved in the process of growing those regulations around the space and really for good purposes and trying to reduce the risk of their corporations and the risk to the consumers with that those outsourcing arrangements. So,
right. I mean, if there are bad outcomes
exactly.
in any particular sphere, you got regulatory concerns to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really interesting to see the growth of the regulatory model. But the reality is the grandfather of regulations, if you will, was really the outsourcing guidance by the U.S. Interagency Guideline Team in 1996. That was kind of the start, if you will, of a landslide of regulations globally that continues till today. But a real original outsourcing guidance had three core components to it, if you will. And those core components are actually still the same core components we see in the regulatory space today, which is accountability, due diligence, and monitoring, meaning that you as a firm who's outsourcing your service still has to be accountable for your own risk and what that service does for you. It also means that you have to perform due diligence, meaning, do I actually want to use this supplier? And that has to be done pre-contracting. And then the fun part, which is actually monitoring that supplier through your engagement with them. And unfortunately, in many cases, through termination of that supplier. So we really continue to see those core principles being highlighted even today in regulations that were the core principles of that initial guidance out in 1996.
Yeah. So, well, and this is to your point, this is really the continuance of what has been a long-standing set of business concerns and what should be the good practices. But we've got regulatory clarification on some of the specifics in terms of where that really fits. I guess I'm curious about, from an S&P perspective, what those third-party initiatives are and how some of those requirements, in particular in some of the, as you pointed out, trickier parts of this on the monitoring side are changing.
Absolutely. And when you kind of take a step back and look at the history of third-party risk management, suppliers of services, technology, consulting work, et cetera, it all began with this idea of how do we help support the industry and customers with managing their very large inventories of suppliers. And the way that vendor community or the vendor supplier community started off was by creating technologies that allowed people to move suppliers from one stage of the life cycle all the way through that termination. But really where there was a large shift in the market over the last couple of years is really focusing on how do we move to this model where we can support that due diligence activity or those ongoing monitoring activities through the usage of data, through the usage of analytics, and really then starting to support the groups and the organizations that are having large inventory increases, but are having reductions, if you will, in internal spend on their own internal capabilities to manage those suppliers. So you have the age-old scenario of too much work, not enough people. So how do you then work smarter and not harder Well, you start to look outside of the world for those data sets, for that analytics to be able to manage the suppliers or monitor those suppliers without having to directly interact with those suppliers. And when you think about S&P as kind of a DNA to the company, while we do offer those workflow capabilities and technologies, the DNA of S&P is really around the understanding of different risks, different factors of companies, of locations of risk. And really where S&P has set out kind of our journey on is really beginning to understand how can we support these customers with working at a very much more effective pace with being able to manage those suppliers through data and analytics without actually having to reach out to those suppliers. Because you can imagine the suppliers are asking their customers to let them just do their jobs, let them focus on building better products, manage the risk, versus having to respond to hundreds and hundreds of questionnaires or requests for due diligence on a daily basis.
Well, this works on both sides of that equation. Of course, the suppliers want to ensure that the information is available so that they don't have to be constantly bombarded with requests. From the end user side, they want to ensure that they've actually got the ability to get the information they need in some reasonably efficient fashion and not have to go out and pull all of their supplier inventory in terms of being able to sort out, to get, accumulate, and then make sense of all of that data. And that's something I think that you pointed out, what I think is one of the fundamental challenges, that we're living in a world in which there is a significant expansion in those ecosystems, I think, for any business out there. And that presents a set of risks, it presented challenges for managing those risks in terms of that much larger supplier universe.
And I think when you really start to look at what does third-party risk management mean, a lot of firms started off their journey and unfortunately still today have to many times focus on compliance before they're actually looking at risk reduction or the industry theory of residual risk reduction, which is the risk that's left over after you understand the controls. And the reality of what firms are really asking for support on, whether that be through internal teams or through external suppliers, is how do I find those needles in the haystack, those needles that'll prick me if we run into them? And the reality of what risk management is rifling through many different elements of understanding of a supplier, of a region, of a location, of a sustainability metric, of cybersecurity controls, et cetera, to truly try to weed out those needles in the haystack to understand where it is that we could be tripped up. And really at S&P, what we continue to focus on, and we know there are many other firms out there working on this as well, which is how do we help our customers uncover those needles in the haystack, therefore turning their programs more from a compliance-focused program to truly managing risk and understanding what those critical risk factors are across their supply chain. And the good news is that we also see in some of the recent regulations that have come out with DORA in Europe or the new interagency guidance that came out in the US, along with SEC and some of the non-financial regulations that are out there, is really an attempt by the regulators to say, look, we understand there are significant compliance needs. We've kind of, they'll never say burden them with, but that's obviously the feeling of the institution. But the reality is what we are seeing is that those regulators are trying to become more open to allowing the people they regulate to become more innovative and effective in finding those needles in the haystack. So I've always really gravitated to this idea of how does the communities and how do we help our customers become way more effective in weeding out those needles? Because when we do that, now we've really supported risk reduction across the industry or across different sectors, which is really the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do as a collective group with third-party risk management.
Well, and we see this in so many disciplines, which is there's that tendency to lean towards what we need to do to be able to get compliant, to deal with the regulatory constraints that we operate under. But yet fundamentally, this should be about making the business more resilient, sturdier, reducing risk in the business itself. And yeah, it's that issue of the urgent upfront pressure is that the regulatory compliance piece, but yet that really should be something that if you're building a robust business, if you're building a resilient business, if you're reducing risk in business operations, hopefully the compliant pieces all shake out of that. But not that there aren't an ever-growing set of compliance requirements. And that's an ecosystem, I guess, that's also becoming more sophisticated, to your point. The regulatory requirements are advancing. You mentioned DORA, the fact that we've got a thing, and for those who aren't familiar with it, right now European requirement in financial services to ensure that the businesses are resilient, and it has as part of it a requirement for third-party due diligence as part of that. Those are things that hopefully you should have been doing, but clearly we've seen a number of instances. We actually, just in the previous episode, we're talking with our fintech team about some notable failures in the fintech world that, of course, had impacts on their end customers. But the regulatory environment is really raising the bar in terms of the sophistication and really creating some much larger drivers for that. And that's something that it feels like is happening really across the board from a regulatory perspective. But what are your thoughts in terms of how they're evolving?
Yeah, and when you continue to look at the regulatory space, there is a shift in a bit more of a knowledge and an understanding of some of the difficulties that are experienced by organizations when trying to manage their supply chain. Yet, not shockingly, we're not seeing any reduction in requirements, to your point. I believe there is more of an attempt to fine tune those requirements to what are those emerging risks. So obviously with DORA, there's more of an attempt to get businesses to truly understand the critical nature of the suppliers to their business, not just necessarily what are those criticality elements, meaning like, do they hold my sensitive data? Yes, that might be a critical risk to your business, to loss of data to your business, et cetera. However, the reality is that's only one component of criticality. Another component of criticality may be that a small company that may not even own or operate the use of your data, they may actually become a critical threat to a business unit, meaning if that firm goes under, your critical business service to your customers may not be able to operate. So when we start to look at where the regulations are tending to move toward, it is more of a business resiliency type of a mindset. For example, last year, and ironically, as we at S&P were updating some of our own regulatory framework programs and protocols for some of our services, the world graced us with about 12 different major regulatory and cybersecurity updates, including things like NIST 2.0, et cetera. But the reality is most of the movement is towards that resiliency phase. And I think that's a good move by the regulators because it truly starts to say, look, risk management is a part of the overall business need. And the reality is before it was more of looked at as just kind of an operational process or a back office process and not really equating it to those customers and the needs of those customers. So what we continue to see with the regulations is a move to thinking through the impact of what actually performing risk management is and why it's important. We continue to see that as a positive step forward. Now, from a next step of a regulation, especially on the cyber side, what we're continuing to hear from some of the constituents or the groups that we work with is while there's definitely been a change to this kind of resiliency mindset, there's also an eye towards some of the emerging technologies. Like, for example, how are we going to actually regulate or incorporate AI into our third-party risk regulations and requirements? As well as a lot of talk today already about should we be looking at third-party risk and how do we start to incorporate requirements and controls for quantum computing, which is a whole nother story. But the reality is we are seeing regulators try to get a little bit more advanced. I think the modernization of technology and the sheer amount of suppliers that are out there in the space has really forced that move. But generally, we do applaud the movement of the regulators to focus more on that resiliency and actually the business impact of reducing risk across the third party in your supply chain.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch this evolve. One of the things we keep expecting in technology is that you have more suppliers and more capabilities, and there's that general broadening. But in fact, we've got some very specific examples of concentration risk in technology, just simply because there are a set of core technologies, and if those core technologies happen to get compromised, we saw that recently with the CrowdStrike outage. If you happen to be on a Windows platform and you happen to be running the CrowdStrike antivirus or any malware, that in fact you had a concentration risk that created all manner of problems. And of course, we've got history with lots of those that are back that may not be completely visible in that broader view in terms of what's actually out there.
And concentration risk is such an interesting scenario because, to your point, it spans multi domains, for a lack of a better way to put that. One interesting example is I don't want to say push, but the regulatory scrutiny on where you may outsource certain business process operations. And the idea that the outsourcing of those business operations would need to be in certain locations or countries that present less risk. However, when you do that, you actually start to see many organizations begin to centralize their business operation outsourcing models in certain countries, which now becomes inherently a concentration risk if something was to happen to those countries. So there is a lot of impacting decisions that are made that may not have been the initial idea and thought process to it. But concentration risk continues to be one of the most crucial elements of third party risk management that still has a long way to go from a true understanding of where those needles in the haystack are, like CrowdStrike, and how do you actually then begin to create resilient ideas or resilient plans around the potential impacts of those causes. So, for example, if we are to see centralization of some of our activities around smaller technology firms, sometimes called fintechs, one of the things that's happened over the last couple of years is we've actually seen about 80% of newly onboarded companies to firms are actually in this fintech definition or emerging technology definitions, which means mostly they are being brought on under some level of venture capitalist ownership or things like that. And obviously, over the last couple of years, there has been a difficult environment to gain capital. So we've also seen a significant amount of those firms in the supply chain have financial concerns assigned to them. So the reality is if we are onboarding more and more of these firms, there becomes also an inherent concentration to the use of a type of supplier, which then has macroeconomic impacts to them. So we've seen a lot of our customers have to make plans to understand the concentration they have around firms that may have capital intensive needs. So long story short, Eric, there's a lot more to go with the concentration risk scenarios that I think haven't been uncovered, but are of utmost importance for people to understand their resiliency.
Well, because again, we can talk about whether or not those are unintended consequences that create concentration, or the byproducts of various either business or regulatory impacts. So many different aspects of that. I guess I'd be interested to know, what really do you see as some of the main challenges? If we've talked on some of these, but where do you see that businesses should be focusing in terms of addressing some of these challenges for managing third-party risk, and how do they get beyond them?
Yeah, and I believe it definitely depends on a little bit of the sector, the regulatory scrutiny, and quite frankly, the size of companies on where those challenges come into play. But I think there's a couple kind of core challenges that people are trying to tackle with today. And alluding to it a little bit earlier, you do inherently have these growing vendor inventories or supplier inventories, whatever you want to call them. And the growth of these inventories are coming from a couple different pieces. One, yes, the desire to outsource more, create significant advantage for your company by outsourcing. But the reality is we also have firms that are getting a lot more sophisticated in their procurement spaces, meaning there's actually controls around identifying the suppliers that you offer versus in the past where anybody from any department could determine to sign a contract and there was no central process for understanding who those suppliers are and quite frankly what their inherent risks are. And so based on this growing and parabolically growing inventory these inventory sizes, just the sheer nature of having those big inventories and having lower resource amounts to be able to actually conduct the analysis that you need to do of that supplier. So you either have to make a couple decisions. Either you just do not assess those companies and kind of hope that nothing goes wrong. Or what we hear today is obviously the ability to try to work smarter and not harder when actually evaluating those companies. So using external data sources, external capabilities. The regulators call some of the activities group audits, which is many institutions grouping together to perform a single analysis of a supplier so they don't have to do it individually. And that's one of the main challenges is how much can you rely and have trust of those outside components versus having to feel like you have to do it yourself. The other component of this based on industry is just simply keeping up with regulations. Like I alluded to earlier, there's 13 last year about 13 major regulatory changes that have material impacts to companies' third-party risk management requirements. And it's very difficult for individual institutions to maintain those regulatory requirements, or at least keep some sort of harmonized analysis of what they need to do across those regulations. And really, when you start to pile those two components on, you have growing inventories, lack of resources to be able to perform the due diligence and the monitoring that you need to do, and the ever changing regulatory world probably makes everybody feel that they're in a bit of a tornado, if you will, of trying to understand and really be able to kind of bring all that together to a halt and to be able to come back to normality. And I think we're unfortunately in a bit of a world where that'll continue to happen for the next little while global regulators continue to try to work together to understand how they can provide more harmonized third-party risk regulations across the globe.
Well, that sort of points us towards that future of can we expect to be in that tornado? I mean, one of the challenges, of course, in a regulatory environment is that regulators do like to regulate, but it was interesting to, as you mentioned, harmonization. Is that a real potential for the future? And I guess what other things looking ahead should businesses be prepared for?
Yeah. So when you kind of look at this ecosystem of customers reaching out to third parties, or third parties having to respond to all their customers, significant overlapping of these requirements when it comes to due diligence and monitoring of suppliers, there is and has been not only a bit of a regulatory shift, if you will, to this idea of allowing for more harmonization to reduce the individual burden that's coming to each individual company. But based on some of that regulatory language that's been used, along with examples of allowing group audits and things like that, you've seen a bit of a shift in the industry, especially on the customer end of the third party world, to move to harmonization. And there's actually a root cause, in my opinion, for why there's been more of a desire to move to harmonization. And that is this existential desire by many firms to move to questionnaire-less onboarding and questionnaire-less monitoring of suppliers. And as you kind of group this all together, which is the need to be more efficient, the idea that regulators are becoming more open to engagement among firms in this non-competitive space, as well as the overall desire to move away from having to ask third parties to create bilateral responses, because obviously that takes time, effort, and resources. You've now seen this shift to more of a need to harmonize, but not only harmonize on the regulations and requirements, but also on the effective data sources that can be used to understand the risk of the suppliers. So that could be examples of using things like SOC reports that are out there more effectively, or using group audit data more effectively, or potentially using things like financial risk analysis that are out there already today and pre-prepared for you to be able to use this data against a harmonized set of control objectives or those risk objectives that you have in order to truly understand on a more ongoing basis the risk of your suppliers. And the reality of what that does is allows you to work smarter, being able to use data to mine for those needles in the haystack that I talk about a lot, but also then to become more efficient. And the good news is the only way to really do that is to become more harmonized across the globe about what actually are those risk control objectives that we're attempting to understand of our supply chain.
It's interesting on the monitoring side, though. The questionnaire-less approach is something that we actually see in a number of other areas. Yeah, our listeners heard us talk about cyber insurance and getting more towards the model that we've seen in automotive insurance, where you've got ongoing measuring, the onboard data port kind of monitoring thing, which is monitoring how you're driving. In cyber insurance, the thought is, again, moving towards a more real-time analysis of how well is your environment performing? Are you sufficiently protecting what you've got to be able to provide some level of anonymized telemetry there? it sounds like in the broader third-party market, that kind of ongoing monitoring telemetry will be just as important, as you said, so that you don't have this compliance event be something that's a point in time. Because, of course, over time, there's shift, there's drift in capabilities. Your supplier infrastructure is going to be changing. Their capabilities are going to change. Being able to do that on an ongoing basis starts to spread some of that effort also, so that you can know at any point in time, rather than having this be the scramble of at whatever the point in the year is in which you happen to be reviewing this, you spend all this effort trying to accumulate all the information, to actually make that a more continuous process.
And become more efficient with your resources and be a good partner of your third party, right? So I think the reality is the more that firms utilize information, analytics, and insights that are out there in the marketplace, you can really start to hone in when you need to call that third party, right? Or maybe when you need to jump on a plane to go visit that third party because we have indications that there is significant risk either happening or about to happen, right? And that's really where you actually get into a risk management phase versus that compliance check the box model. So what we continue to hear from our constituents and really across the industry is we really want to be smarter on when we have to use our third parties' time. So I'm sure the CISOs and the network engineers and all the team members from those suppliers of the industry would be very happy to be able to focus on maintaining their controls and building their products appropriately. And really, this is the way to do that. And the good news is this isn't necessarily something that we're just hearing by more nimble companies. This is actually the same desires and ideas that we're hearing from some of the highest regulated or the most regulated institutions in the globe, that we just as a group have to become more effective and efficient with our third-party risk management processes, which then inherently creates really this idea of a residual risk reduction across all of the industry or all of the sector, which is the ultimate goal of what the regulations are trying to get to.
Well, and it gets right back to the point that you made at the outset, which is that this is all about reducing risk in the business, making the business more resilient, and making the probability of success for the business all that much higher, which is really what we should be working for, right?
I completely agree with you.
Well, this has been great, Luke. I appreciate all the perspectives in the background. We've got some links in the show notes pointing our listeners to some of the research, some things that we've been talking about here. But it's been great having you on the podcast.
Eric, thank you very much, and I appreciate the time.
There's so much more that we could potentially talk about, but that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Faran Mudayashin, and Kira Smith on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're talking about an aspect of AI, building the data pipeline. It's actually, how do you start to ingest a lot of this telemetry we've been talking about and actually put it to work? I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.